Can't hear anything on
Great.
Gather.
And it's called Blockchain Stretching and Squeezing, Manipulating Time for Your Best Interest. And the talk is going to be split into roughly two parts. The first one will be dedicated to manipulating blockchain block rates, and I'll explain in a minute what they are. And the second half will be dedicated to using the aforementioned manipulations in order to create interest rate arbitrage. The motivation for this work is that, first of all, cryptocurrencies are somewhat popular, I think. And for example, one Bitcoin is worth roughly $20,000. And in this work, we explore both Bitcoin and Ethereum. And Ethereum has an additional maybe value as a platform on which smart contracts can be created and run. Smart contracts are essentially decentralized programs which run on top of the Ethereum blockchain. And specifically, platforms such as Compound and AAVE let users perform all kinds of financial operations, for example, exchange tokens or deposit funds and accrue interest, and so they're called decentralized finance platforms. And they're also popular, though they hold a combined value of $73 billion, unless it collapsed even more since I took this picture. And both the cryptocurrencies and these platforms rely on something called the block rate to work properly. And again, I'll explain in a minute what the block rate is. And in this work, we mess up the block rate. Great, so before we get on with the results, some preliminaries. In cryptocurrencies, users can exchange funds by creating transactions which are transmitted to entities called miners who collect the transactions in blocks. In order for a block to be considered valid, miners must attach to it a solution to some cryptographic puzzle, and this solution can only be found by using brute force. Once such a solution is found, it is attached to the block, and the block is transmitted to the network. The network verifies the solution and appends the block and the transactions contained within to their local ledger. Because finding a solution was hard, we compensate miners with a block reward for their efforts. Great. Simply a monetary reward. Great. So it seems reasonable to think that if miners create blocks, and if miners are free to join or leave the system whenever they want, which is indeed the case, then if miners leave, we have less miners to create blocks, and thus probably the block generation rate will be lower, and vice versa. So unfortunately, we cannot let the block rate change too much, because it has somewhat of a Goldilocks zone. Cryptocurrencies are designed with a specific expected blockchain rate in order to work properly. And if the actual block rate is higher, then this might impact security. And I won't get into detail, but I put some references if you're interested. And if the block rate is too low, then this obviously impacts transaction throughput because transactions are collected in blocks. And if we have less blocks, we have less transactions. And having a low block rate also affects other things like security. Again, I put some references in the slide. In order to make sure that the rate is indeed within this Goldilocks zone, we have something that's called a difficulty adjustment algorithm. And if the rate is deemed to be too low or too high, the algorithm adjusts the expected amount of attempts that the cryptographic puzzle is required in order to be solved. So this will hopefully change the expected time until mining the next block, and thus also change the block rate to be what we want it to be. So in our paper, we show that both in Bitcoin and Ethereum, the difficulty adjustment algorithms are actually quite easily manipulable. And we term the two kinds of manipulations that miners can perform as stretching manipulations, in which miners stretch the time between blocks and thus lower the block rate, and squeezing manipulations, in which they do the opposite. So this graph shows our results for stretching. And the blue line is Ethereum, the orange line is Bitcoin. As you can see, for example, for a 25% miner with 25% of all mining power in the network, that miner can stretch the time over 60,000 blocks by more than 50%, which is a lot in Ethereum. And while in Bitcoin, the same miner can only do so can only stretch the time by 5%, much lower, which is quite surprising because Ethereum is supposed to be maybe newer, maybe better, maybe with better PR than Bitcoin. So yeah, with regards to squeezing, the other kind of manipulation, both in Bitcoin and in Ethereum, miners cannot really squeeze time by much. But again, here, Ethereum is worse than Bitcoin. Surprising, not surprising, you decide. So to give you some intuition with regards to how we obtain these results, first let me explain how Bitcoin's DAA works, difficulty adjustment algorithm. The block rate in Bitcoin should be around 1 block per 10 minutes, which translates to 2016 blocks per 2 weeks. Such a period of blocks is called an epoch, and we set the difficulty to be some value within each epoch. So if, for example, the epoch in green has a difficulty of D, and if it was mined within pi times 2 weeks, then in Bitcoin, we will adjust the difficulty of the next epoch, the one in blue, to be pi times D. And because mining time is proportional to mining difficulty, this alone means, this slight change means that the length, the expected time to mine the blue epoch will be exactly 2 weeks. But only if the mining power that was active on the green epoch remains completely unchanged in the blue one. But why would it remain unchanged? Miners can do whatever they want. They can enter and leave whenever they want. So miners can affect the expected time of the blue epoch by simply turning off their machines or by buying more machines or whatever. So in Ethereum, the mechanism is quite different. The block rate is much faster. It's 1 block per 13 seconds. And in Ethereum, the difficulty of the currently mined block is changed on the fly according to various parameters. For example, if the time since the last value block was observed is too low, we'll increase the difficulty of the currently mined block in order to make sure we won't succeed in mining it too quickly. On the other hand, if the time is too high, we'll decrease mining difficulty in order to make sure we'll mine this new block sooner rather than later. Additionally, if miners observe that 2 blocks were mined in parallel to each other, they will pick one of these blocks to be the parent, the other to be the uncle or omer or aunt or whatever. And because seeing 2 blocks being mined within roughly the same time means that maybe the difficulty is too low, Ethereum's mechanism will adjust the current block's difficulty to be higher. So we will hopefully lower the block rate and make sure that 2 blocks won't be mined in parallel again. So without getting into much detail, Ethereum's difficulty adjustment algorithm is actually quite maybe too much affected by these so-called uncle blocks. And additionally, Ethereum's difficulty adjustment algorithm is asymmetrical, meaning that the amount by which difficulty can increase is relatively low to the amount by which it can decrease. And in our paper, we use these 2 facts in order to manipulate Ethereum's block rate, and this precisely is what makes Ethereum so vulnerable. So this is, again, the same graph as before, but now we've added this green line. This green line represents the amount by which miners can stretch a modified Ethereum in which uncle blocks are disabled. And as you can see, the original Ethereum was much worse than Bitcoin, while the new modified Ethereum is much better. And the only change was disabling uncles. Great. So in the paper, we show that in certain settings, there are some optimal strategies. And we use deep reinforcement learning in order to find good strategies for other settings. We all know that miners, now we know miners can stretch and squeeze the time between blocks. But why would they do that? Miners are rational beings, hopefully, and they want to make a profit. Why would they do something like this? So they would do this because they can actually make a profit by doing this. Before I get into more detail, a few years back, Golan and Spiegelman and Fial et al. Wrote 2 similar papers and published them in EC. And their goal was to increase mining profits for existing Bitcoin miners by reducing their variable expenses, which are chiefly electricity that is paid for turning on their mining machines. And they show that by repeatedly turning their machines on and off, miners can obviously reduce their expenses because when machines are off, they don't have to pay for electricity. And as you recall, I said a bit earlier that by turning off machines, miners mess up the block rate. So these papers show that in spite of messing up the block rate, miners can actually do this to increase the rate of revenue, of net revenue. The problem is that the net revenue is obtained from block rewards, which will converge to 0 in Bitcoin by design. So we tried asking the following questions. What about other cryptocurrencies, such as Ethereum? What about other sources of income which will not converge to zero? And what about miners who do not have variable costs? Because we know that miners usually buy electricity in bulk way in advance. So one might argue that electricity isn't as variable as one might want it to be. The other source of income that we're looking at our paper is decentralized finance, the same platforms I talked about earlier. Specifically, we're looking at platforms such as Compound AAV. These platforms allow users to deposit funds and accrue interest on them, or take out a borrow and accrue negative interest on that loan. These platforms can be roughly categorized into two categories. The first, like AAV, accrues interest according to the elapsed time since the last time interest was accrued. And the other, like Compound, accrues interest according to the number of blocks since the last time interest was accrued. And we ask, why not use both? Miners can actually use both to create excess profits for themselves. They can do so by taking out a loan from one kind of platform, depositing it in another, and then messing up the block rate in order to create interest rate arbitrage, meaning that the interest which will be accrued on the deposit will be higher than the interest which is owed to the loan. And this interest rate arbitrage can actually provide quite a lot of profits. For example, an Ethereum miner which will take a loan of 1,000 ETH can increase its net profit by 10% compared to using the honest protocol by adopting our strategies. And this profit can only increase if the loan is increased. And the profit also depends on the amount of interest which decentralized finance platforms offer. So if the interest which is offered is 12%, miners can increase their profits by up to 60%, which is quite a lot. And the take-home message of this slide and this work is that decentralized finance platforms offer incentives which compete with the traditional incentives of blockchains, which are the block rewards. And these incentives encourage miners to maybe deviate from the honest protocol, for example, by stretching and squeezing the block rate. In our paper, we show that in certain settings, there are certain safe bounds that if we set system parameters to be within these bounds, then miners will not have an incentive to deviate. For example, if we increase the block reward, then miners will have less of a reason to deviate. Great, so that's it. We have lots of more results in the paper. I encourage you to read it, and we have lots of time for questions.
Okay, so there is indeed lots of time for questions. So if you would like to ask a question from the room, please approach the mic. And I believe... You should be able to hear it. Yeah, it's a room mic. Oh, it's a room mic. Yeah, so you can hear it. Got it. Okay, forget what I said. You just raise your hand. And then for anyone on Gather who wants to ask a question, those will... I'll let you. Okay. Then you can do that and we can answer those.
They're trying to get more interest out of the protocol, but how does these protocols count time?
So there are two kinds of protocols. Some count according to time, to real-world time, and obviously we don't have access to real-world clocks within the blockchain, so protocols like AAV actually account for time according to the timestamps contained within blocks, even though it is widely known the timestamps are irreliable.
Of the block, can you
So that's the point. AAV, for example, accounts for time according to timestamps, while Compound accounts for time according to the number of blocks. And when we assume that the block rate is indeed constant in expectation, this might work, but it isn't, as we've shown, and thus we are able to achieve our excess profits.
First result, I guess, are you assuming there's no, like the only attack vector is turning on and off machines and no selfish mining, no orphaning?
So you're correct. Like this is a great question. Selfish mining and various other attacks affect the block rate, indeed. We don't do so because, well, that's been explored in other papers, but we didn't analyze the amount, the effect, the magnitude of effect of these existing attacks. Except in Ethereum, where we do something kind of like a hybrid block withholding. When miners, we let miners intentionally mine uncle blocks. This means that they mine a block and wait for the honest majority or non-majority to publish a block, and then only then publish their own. So that's kind of like selfish mining minus, you know.
So this may be slightly outside the scope, but maybe correlated. So if the miner decide to form correlations, for example, does your analysis may provide some different type of insight into how they
Can you maybe come to the...
So if the miner, for example, decide to create correlations, they decide to cooperate with each other. So will this time stretching-based analysis provide some insight on how they can, as a group, benefit?
So this can help other miners. For example, if miners see that maybe someone else is already attempting to stretch the time, then they can do the same, exactly the same manipulation in order to also profit, right? So they can form coalitions. And something similar was explored in the two papers which I've mentioned, but on a slightly different scope.
Yeah.
Are there any like long-range sort of things of like the withdrawal mechanism for these two protocols have different semantics, right? So if I withdraw from Compound, the way the interest rate is computed is very different from Omni, not just from like what per block accrual.
Yeah.
Is there something where I can do a sequence of stretch and squeezes where I maximize or really long range withdrawal? Or than just like a single block arc?
So we've begun actually doing something similar. Don't scoop us again.
All right, maybe last question. Yeah.
Okay, do you have any insights on how to defend these attacks?
On what?
How to defend the
defend. So, for example, one can improve Ethereum by disabling uncle blocks. This might have other consequences, right? Both Bitcoin and Ethereum can adopt pair difficulty adjustment algorithms. Other exist, and yeah, we have actually a bunch of other ideas in the paper.